A manuscript written more than 1,500 years ago was almost destroyed 7 centuries later, not by fire, war, or decay, but by someone doing something completely ordinary. Its parchment pages were pulled apart and reused to strengthen other books. The original text disappeared from view. Some pages became binding material. Others became protective leaves inside unrelated manuscripts. The pieces traveled across Europe and Russia, ending up in libraries in different countries. For hundreds of years, scholars could hold the books containing those fragments without realizing what was hiding inside them. Then, in 2026, researchers using multispectral imaging discovered that 42 lost pages of the ancient manuscript could be digitally recovered. They were not found in a secret chamber. They were hiding inside other books. And the most surprising part is that the technology did not simply photograph faint writing. It detected chemical traces left behind when centuries-old ink interacted with the pages around it, creating ghost-like impressions that could finally be reconstructed. The manuscript is known as Codex H, a 6th century Greek copy associated with the letters of Paul, and its recovery is giving scholars a rare opportunity to examine a Christian text tradition that survived for roughly 15 centuries. To understand why 42 pages matter so much, you have to understand what Codex H actually is. The manuscript belongs to the Greek tradition of the New Testament and contains the Pauline Epistles, the collection of letters traditionally attributed to Paul of Tarsus. These letters are among the earliest Christian writings that survive in substantial textual traditions, and they became central to Christian theology long before the medieval period. But the original documents written in Paul's own lifetime do not survive. What scholars have are handwritten copies made generations later. Every ancient manuscript, therefore, becomes part of a giant reconstruction project. Researchers compare surviving copies to identify agreements, differences, scribal mistakes, editorial changes, and traditions that developed as texts moved between communities. Codex H is especially valuable because it is a 6th century witness and is associated with the Euthalian tradition, a system of textual organization that included divisions, lists, prefaces, and other features designed to help readers navigate the New Testament. The manuscript is therefore important, not simply because of its age, but because of the information it can provide about how early Christian scribes organized and transmitted Paul's letters. The 6th century was a very different world from the one that produced today's printed Bibles. There were no printing presses. There were no standardized editions that could be reproduced thousands of times. A manuscript existed because someone physically copied it. A scribe had to prepare parchment, write the text, organize the pages, correct errors, and assemble the finished book. The process was slow and expensive. Parchment itself required animal skins and considerable labor. A major manuscript was therefore not simply a container for words. It was a valuable physical object. That fact becomes crucial later because the same parchment that preserved Paul's letters for centuries eventually became valuable for a completely different reason. Long after its original text had aged, the material itself could still be reused. Codex H was associated with the great Lavra monastery on Mount Athos, a place with an extraordinary manuscript history. The Great Lavra was founded in 963 and remains the oldest of the 20 major monasteries on Mount Athos. The peninsula has operated for centuries as a major center of Eastern Orthodox monasticism and manuscript preservation. Its libraries contain enormous collections of handwritten texts that survived wars, political changes, fires, changing dynasties, and the simple passage of time. A 6th century Christian manuscript surviving at such a location might seem almost destined to remain intact forever. But medieval preservation was not the same thing as modern conservation. Monks did not have climate-controlled archives or modern archival policy. Their libraries were working environments. Books were used, repaired, rebound, copied, and sometimes dismantled. When an old manuscript was considered damaged or no longer useful in its original form, the parchment could be given another life. At some point between the 10th and 13th centuries, Codex H was disassembled. The exact circumstances remain part of the manuscript's later history, but the physical evidence shows what happened afterward. Its parchment leaves were reused as binding material in flyleaves and other manuscripts. In other words, pages that once carried the Pauline Epistles became structural components of unrelated books. This sounds destructive to modern ears, but it was not necessarily unusual from a medieval practical perspective. Parchment was expensive. If an older manuscript was damaged, incomplete, or no longer needed, its material could still be useful. A strong sheet of animal skin could reinforce a binding. It could protect the beginning or end of another book. It could be folded, trimmed, covered, and incorporated into a new object. Nobody needed to believe that they were destroying an irreplaceable 6th century witness. They were simply reusing valuable material. And this practical decision created one of the strangest preservation stories in manuscript history. Codex H disappeared as a complete book, but fragments of it survived inside other books. The destruction scattered the manuscript rather than eliminating it completely. Over the centuries, its surviving pieces ended up in collections connected with Italy, Greece, Russia, Ukraine, and France, while other fragments remained associated with the Great Lavra. Scholars knew some fragments existed, and researchers had already been investigating the manuscript's complicated history. But the full scale of what survived was difficult to see, because the original pages were no longer sitting together as one recognizable codex. They had become pieces of other manuscripts. This is the point where the story changes from medieval history into modern scientific detective work. Researchers led by Professor Garrick Allen of the University of Glasgow began examining the surviving material with a very specific clue in mind. They knew the manuscript had been re-inked at some stage during its later history. That detail turned out to matter enormously. When new ink is placed onto old parchment and a manuscript is closed, chemicals in the ink can interact with the facing pages. Over time, the ink can produce what researchers describe as offset damage, leaving a faint mirror-like impression on the neighboring surface. Under ordinary lighting, these impressions can be almost impossible to see. A human eye, looking at a medieval book, might see nothing except blank parchment, discoloration, or stains. But chemically, the page can still retain a shadow of writing that was once pressed against it. Imagine taking a page, writing on it with wet ink, closing the book, and leaving it untouched for centuries. The ink may not stay completely where the medieval scribe intended. Some chemical material can migrate or react with adjacent parchment. The result is not another perfect copy of the original writing. It is more like a ghost. Broken letters, faint shapes, chemical residues, partial impressions. To 19th century scholars, this would have been practically useless. Even early 20th century photography might not have been enough, but modern imaging technology can examine wavelengths of light that human vision cannot perceive and use computational techniques to separate extremely faint signals from the background surface of the parchment. This is where multispectral imaging becomes essential. Instead of photographing a manuscript only under ordinary visible light, researchers capture images across multiple wavelengths. Different materials absorb and reflect different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. Ink, parchment stains, chemical residues, and erased writing can therefore behave differently when illuminated with different wavelengths. A mark invisible under normal lighting may become much more obvious in another spectral band. Computer processing can then combine the images and enhance the differences. The result is not artificial writing invented by a machine. The technology is revealing physical information that already exists on the object. In the case of Codex H, the imaging was able to expose faint traces caused by the ancient manuscript's later treatment and reuse. The crucial clue was that the hidden material was not necessarily located where a person would naturally look. Some of the surviving Codex H fragments were physically incorporated into later bindings. The Pauline text might therefore be partially blocked by another book's structure. A page might be folded, another page might sit directly against it, a binding might cover part of the surface. Researchers had to treat the host manuscripts almost like archaeological sites. Every layer mattered. The modern book was not merely a container, it was evidence about what had happened to the older book. That is why the discovery is so different from the way ancient manuscripts are usually imagined. A famous manuscript can be sitting on a shelf behind protective glass, complete enough to photograph and study. Codex H was something else. Its fragments had been broken apart and dispersed. Researchers were effectively reconstructing a destroyed object from secondary evidence. A leaf in one library could connect to a leaf in another country. A piece of parchment used as a flyleaf could contain information matching a different fragment hidden inside a binding. The research required codicology, textual criticism, conservation science, imaging, digital reconstruction, and international collaboration. And then the number appeared. 42. 42 lost pages of Codex H were recovered through the project. That does not mean 42 pristine sheets suddenly emerged from nowhere. It means researchers were able to identify and reconstruct substantial portions of the manuscript's missing material through a combination of surviving physical fragments and digitally recovered traces. The pages had been effectively lost as readable portions of the original codex. Now they could be brought back into scholarly consideration. The manuscript was still fragmented, but the amount of information available was dramatically increased. The University of Glasgow described the result as the recovery of 42 lost pages from one of the world's important early New Testament manuscripts. So what was actually recovered? The answer is more interesting than the internet-friendly version that might suggest an entirely unknown gospel or a secret Christian doctrine. The recovered material belongs to the textual and paratextual world of the Pauline Epistles and the Euthalian tradition. That means scholars can examine not only the biblical text itself, but also the ways ancient readers and scribes organized it. Lists, divisions, textual structures, and scribal practices can tell scholars how the book was intended to be used. A manuscript is not just its words. Its physical organization provides evidence about how communities read those words. This is particularly valuable because the Euthalian tradition is a fascinating window into early Christian reading culture. The tradition included divisions and supplementary material that helped readers navigate books that, by modern standards, would have been difficult to use. Without chapter numbers, modern page layouts, or standardized headings, scribes developed methods for organizing large collections of texts. The physical structure of a manuscript could guide how a reader understood the relationship between sections. Recovering missing portions of Codex H therefore allows scholars to study the manuscript not only as a carrier of Paul's letters, but as a designed reading experience. That matters because textual scholars are not simply asking, what did Paul write? They are also asking, how did later communities receive Paul's writings? A 6th century manuscript cannot give us Paul's original handwriting. It cannot take us directly back to the 1st century. But it can tell us what a particular Christian textual tradition looked like centuries later. When researchers compare many manuscripts, they can identify patterns in copying. One manuscript may preserve an older reading, another may show a later change. A third may contain an unusual scribal correction. None of these alone solves the entire history. Together, however, they allow scholars to build a much more detailed picture of transmission. That is why every additional page matters. 42 pages may sound small compared with the size of a modern Bible, but in manuscript studies, a single surviving page can change a reconstruction. If a particular passage was previously known only from a handful of witnesses, an additional early manuscript can provide another comparison. If a scribal feature appears unexpectedly, it may reveal a tradition researchers did not fully recognize. If the same structural system appears across multiple books, it can reveal how early Christian scribes organized Scripture. The value lies in the accumulation of evidence. And there's another reason this discovery is remarkable. Nothing dramatic had to be excavated. No archaeologist had to break through a sealed wall. No ancient tomb had to be opened. No forgotten monastery needed to be discovered. The books were already in libraries. People had already cataloged them. Researchers had already studied some of the host manuscripts. The lost material was physically present. What was missing was the ability to see it. That is a recurring pattern in modern archaeology and manuscript research. Technology increasingly turns objects that appear ordinary into sources of information. A blackened scroll may look destroyed until imaging reveals letters inside. A painted surface may contain an earlier image beneath it. A parchment page may appear blank but retain erased writing. A piece of reused binding material may preserve text that disappeared from its original book centuries earlier. Codex H belongs to that larger scientific revolution. The key word is recovery, not invention. Researchers are not writing a missing page from imagination. They are reconstructing information from physical evidence. The imaging can reveal traces. Specialists identify letters and words. Digital tools can help align fragments. Textual scholars compare the recovered readings with known versions. Each stage can be questioned and tested. This process also explains why the discovery does not mean biblical scholars have suddenly found an entirely new version of Christianity. The recovered pages are important, but they are not presented by the researchers as proof that a hidden gospel has been discovered. The historical value lies in the transmission of known Pauline material and in understanding the manuscript tradition surrounding it. In fact, one of the most useful things about the discovery is how ordinary its content may seem to someone unfamiliar with textual scholarship. The power is not necessarily in shocking new theology, it is in the precision with which ancient textual evidence can now be examined. The recovery also demonstrates how destructive medieval manuscript recycling could accidentally become a preservation mechanism. When Codex H was dismantled, the original object was damaged. The decision erased the manuscript as a complete physical unit. But because the pages were reused rather than burned or discarded, portions remained physically preserved. A leaf hidden inside another book could survive centuries of handling while the rest of the original manuscript disappeared. The very act that destroyed the codex preserved fragments of it. There's something almost poetic about that. The 6th century scribes created a book expecting it to preserve sacred words. 700 years later, medieval scribes took the book apart. They used the parchment to protect other books. Those books survived. The fragments survived inside them. And more than 7 centuries later, scientists looked at the traces left by the reuse and began reconstructing the original. A page written in one age became the binding of another age, and eventually became data for the 21st century. This is also why the Great Lavra matters so much. The monastery was not merely the location where the manuscript happened to end up. It was an institutional center of manuscript preservation and copying. The library represents a continuous chain of Byzantine and Orthodox intellectual history. The fact that Codex H passed through such an institution connects the 6th century with later medieval readers and eventually with modern scholars. The manuscript's journey is therefore a miniature history of the survival of written culture. The story also challenges an assumption people often make about ancient texts, that if a manuscript disappears, its content is simply gone forever. Sometimes that is true. Most ancient books have been lost completely, but manuscripts can leave behind fragments, quotations, recycled parchment, catalog descriptions, or later copies. A destroyed book can continue to exist in pieces that no one recognizes as belonging together. That is exactly what makes digital reconstruction so powerful. A physical library may contain thousands of manuscripts distributed across separate collections. A computer can compare high-resolution images from all of them. Researchers can search for patterns in handwriting, page dimensions, parchment characteristics, ink traces, and textual sequences. Geographic separation becomes less of a barrier. A fragment sitting in Paris can be compared with another in Turin without either object needing to travel. The Codex H project itself demonstrates that principle. The international team includes specialists and institutions working across different countries, including the Great Lavra Monastery and libraries connected with the surviving fragments. The project's official website describes its broader goal as investigating the origins, transmission, and function of the Euthalian tradition and using digital methods to connect dispersed manuscript evidence. And the timing is important. This discovery comes at a moment when scholars are increasingly using imaging technologies to revisit manuscripts that had already been considered known. Researchers are realizing that the next major discoveries do not always require finding new objects. Sometimes the objects are already in museums and libraries. The frontier is seeing more information inside things we already possess. That changes the economics and ethics of historical research as well. Excavating an archaeological site can damage fragile contexts. Opening a bound manuscript can damage the book itself. Multispectral imaging can sometimes produce valuable information without dismantling the object. Researchers can photograph a page or binding under controlled conditions and then analyze the images digitally. The physical manuscript remains preserved while scientists work with a detailed digital representation. Of course, imaging is not magic. It has limitations. Not every hidden text can be recovered. Not every chemical trace produces readable letters. Damage can overlap with writing. Later ink can interfere with older ink. Parchment can degrade. A digital reconstruction may remain incomplete. Scholars must distinguish what is clearly visible from what is inferred. That scientific discipline is especially important in a field where a single unclear letter can change the meaning of a word. This is why Codex H is not simply a story about technology. It is a story about patience. Researchers needed the historical knowledge to recognize that rinking had occurred. They needed conservation science to understand how ink could produce offset traces. They needed imaging equipment capable of detecting those traces. They needed scholars who could interpret ancient Greek. They needed textual specialists who could compare recovered passages, and they needed librarians and institutions willing to collaborate across borders. Remove any one of those pieces, and the recovery becomes much harder. The result, therefore, belongs to a very modern kind of scholarship: collaborative, digital, international, and interdisciplinary. A manuscript written in the 6th century can now be reconstructed through technology developed in the 21st century, with fragments stored in multiple countries and interpreted by scholars who may never physically see all of the pieces in one place. That is extraordinary. But perhaps the strangest detail is still the simplest. For hundreds of years, the missing pages were not missing in the normal sense. They were right there. They had become someone else's book. Imagine opening a medieval manuscript today and discovering that part of the binding contains parchment written centuries earlier. Most people would assume it was simply old material. A specialist might recognize the handwriting. A trained researcher could examine the parchment and notice that the page belongs to another manuscript. But without multispectral imaging, some information could remain invisible even after the fragment's existence was suspected. Now the technology allows researchers to go one step deeper. It can reveal not just what survives visibly, but traces left by the physical history of the page. Ink that moved, ink that transferred, writing that left an impression, chemical changes that accumulated over centuries. The book has become a record not just of what was written on it, but of everything that happened to it afterward. That idea completely changes how we should think about old manuscripts. A damaged page is not necessarily a useless page. A reused page is not necessarily a destroyed page. A blank page is not necessarily blank. A binding is not necessarily just a binding. Every layer can contain evidence, and the surviving 42 pages of Codex H are proof. There's another historical irony here. The monks who reused the parchment were not trying to preserve Paul's letters for future scholars. They were solving a practical problem with the resources available to them. Their decision probably made perfect sense in their own world. A damaged old book could become useful material for a new one. What they could not know was that 700 years later, the old writing would have enormous scholarly value. This is one of the recurring tragedies of history. The people making decisions in the present cannot know which ordinary objects will become priceless evidence in the future. A broken bowl becomes an archaeological artifact. An abandoned building becomes a historical monument. A scrap of parchment becomes a lost manuscript. A bundle of old papers becomes evidence for a forgotten event. The value changes because the questions change. For medieval scribes, Codex H was old parchment. For modern textual scholars, it is a 6th century witness. For imaging scientists, it is a complex optical and chemical surface. For historians, it is evidence of how Christian texts were transmitted. For conservators, it is a delicate physical object. For digital researchers, it is a data set. One manuscript can therefore become several different things depending on the person studying it. And perhaps the most important lesson is that history is rarely recovered all at once. The original manuscript was created in the 6th century. It survived for centuries. It was disassembled. Its pages were redistributed. The fragments were incorporated into other books. The books traveled. Libraries preserved them. Scholars eventually recognized the relationship between fragments. Scientists developed better imaging. Digital reconstruction brought the pieces together. And now, in 2026, 42 pages can once again be studied as parts of the manuscript they originally belonged to. That timeline is almost impossible to appreciate in normal human terms. A person who saw Codex H when it was first copied would have lived in the 6th century. A person who saw the manuscript being disassembled centuries later would have known nothing about modern biblical scholarship. A monk who used one of its pages inside another binding could not have imagined scholars reading that page 15 centuries after its creation. Yet here we are. The words survived. Not because the book remained intact. They survived because some physical trace of the writing remained somewhere. That is what makes this discovery so powerful. It does not tell us that the past is perfectly preserved. For centuries, researchers depended on what their eyes could see. Then photography expanded that ability. Microscopy expanded it further. Infrared and ultraviolet imaging revealed things ordinary photographs could not. Multispectral systems pushed the boundary again. Now, machine-assisted analysis and digital reconstruction can compare thousands of images and identify relationships across collections. The historical record is not becoming larger because the past is changing. It is becoming larger because our ability to perceive it is changing. And that may be the most exciting part of the discovery. The 42 pages did not appear from nowhere. They were waiting inside old bindings, waiting inside flyleaves, waiting in libraries, waiting for scientists to realize that the chemistry of an ancient mistake could become the key to reading an ancient text. No secret society was needed, no hidden chamber, no forbidden archive, just parchment, ink, time, and technology. The manuscript that once seemed to have disappeared was never completely gone. It had simply been broken into pieces, small enough for history to overlook. And now those pieces are speaking again, not with a new religion, not with a sensational revelation, but with something much more valuable to historians: evidence. Evidence of how an early Christian manuscript was copied, evidence of how scribes organized Paul's letters, evidence of how manuscripts were reused in the medieval world, evidence that ancient texts can sometimes be recovered from places nobody thought to look, and a reminder that some of the world's most important historical discoveries may already be sitting in front of us. A book in a library may contain another book inside it. A page may contain another page's ghost. A binding may contain a lost chapter. And a manuscript thought to be gone for 700 years may still be waiting for someone to look at it differently. Codex H was once a book. Then it became pieces. Then those pieces became parts of other books. Now technology has begun turning them back into evidence of the original. The recovery of 42 pages does not mean the entire mystery is finished. Many fragments remain dispersed, and the complete original codex is not magically restored as a physical object. Researchers still have questions about its construction, transmission, later use, and the precise history of every surviving fragment. But the boundary has moved. What could once only be guessed can now be examined. What once seemed permanently lost can now be partially reconstructed. And that is how history sometimes returns. Not with a dramatic discovery underground, not with a treasure chest, not with someone opening a door that has been sealed since antiquity. Sometimes history returns as a chemical shadow on an old piece of animal skin. Sometimes it returns from the spine of a book. Sometimes it appears only when a machine shines light at something human eyes cannot see. And sometimes the thing everyone thought was gone was never really gone at all. It was hiding in plain sight.